There's a skull sitting in a museum in France. And the first time a 19th century scientist picked it up, he did what any reasonable person would do. He put it right back down, took a long pause, and probably needed a moment. Because there's a hole in it. Not a small one. We're talking about a gap the size of a golf ball punched through the top of a human skull. Clean edges, geometric, deliberate. His first instinct? War wound. Some kind of axe or club that cracked the bone and left this cavity behind. Made sense. These were prehistoric people. Brutal era. People hit each other with rocks for a living. But then someone looked closer, and what they found under a magnifying glass didn't match the war wound theory at all. The edges of the hole weren't fractured. They weren't splintered or jagged the way they would be if something smashed into that skull with force. The edges were smooth, rounded, almost polished, like the bone had been slowly, carefully worked away over time. And then, the part that broke everything. They found new bone growth. Millimeters of fresh calcification along the rim of that hole. Biological evidence that this person's body had tried to heal itself, which means when this hole was made, this person was very much alive. And not only were they alive during the procedure, they survived it for years, maybe decades. Welcome to one of the most disturbing detective stories in human history. A crime scene that turned out not to be a crime at all, but something far stranger. Proof that 7,000 years ago, on the dirt floor of a Neolithic settlement, someone was performing open brain surgery, and doing it better than some doctors did in the American Civil War. Let me tell you about the skull. It was excavated near Ensisheim, in what is now the Alsace region of France. The man who owned it was about 50 years old. For the prehistoric world, that's practically a legend. Living to 50 back then means you'd won some kind of biological lottery repeatedly. He was buried with an arrowhead and a stone adze, which helped date the grave to roughly 5100 to 4900 BCE. That's 7,000 years ago. Before the pyramids, before writing, before the wheel. And when researchers analyzed that skull with modern microscopy, they didn't find one trepanation. They found two separate surgeries. The smaller hole, toward the front of his skull, about 2.6 by 2.4 inches, had healed almost completely. New bone had grown back across the defect, slowly over what would have been years of recovery. The larger hole on top, 3.7 by 3.6 inches, was about 2/3 covered with new growth, meaning he survived the first surgery long enough to need a second one, and survived that one too. The edges weren't hacked. They were cut with intersecting incisions, careful and controlled in a precise geometric pattern. Now imagine being one of those 19th century researchers. You've spent your whole career thinking of prehistoric people as primitive, barely above animals, grunting around campfires, bashing each other senseless. And then this skull lands on your desk and quietly destroys everything. Because this wasn't a guy who got hit in the head. This was a patient. Now picture the same skull from the inside of the story. You are there, somewhere in what will someday be France. The year is roughly 3,000 years before anyone thought to invent the concept of a year. Your patient is lying in front of you. He's conscious, probably, or barely. You've given him something to dull the pain, maybe a fermented drink, maybe a plant decoction that knocked the edge off his senses. But there's no anesthesia in any modern sense of the word. No sterile gloves. No overhead light. No backup plan. There is dirt. There are stone tools. And there is the inside of a skull that needs to be accessed. I want you to pause on that for 1 second, because I need you to feel the full insanity of what I'm describing. No MRI. No CT scan. You can't see what's happening inside his head. You can't measure intracranial pressure on a screen. You're working off observation alone. The way his face looks, the way he moves, the kinds of headaches or seizures or behavioral changes that made whoever was in charge of the tribe's healing look at this man and say, I need to open his skull. And they did it anyway. The technique for this specific burial site involved making a series of intersecting cuts, essentially a grid pattern scored directly into the cranial bone, gradually, incrementally, without cutting too deep and damaging the membrane underneath. Because if you slip even a few millimeters too far, you're through the dura mater, into the brain tissue. and the whole thing is over. This person knew exactly where to stop. That's not instinct. That's not luck. That is learned empirical knowledge passed down through generations. Someone figured this out through practice, through watching what worked and what didn't, and then taught the next person, and they taught the next person. This was a medical tradition, and here's what shatters the primitive savage stereotype completely. That tradition spanned the entire world. Here's the thing that scientists don't talk about enough, because it breaks the very clean narrative of human progress we've built for ourselves. Trepanation wasn't some isolated fluke. It wasn't one weird genius in France who accidentally invented brain surgery. Thousands of trepanned skulls have been found worldwide. In France, in Ukraine, where sites like Vasilyevka show evidence of cranial surgeries dating back to 9,000 or 10,000 BCE. In Russia, in China, in East Africa, in Peru, where more trepanned skulls have been found than in the rest of the planet combined. These cultures had no contact with each other. They didn't share a language, a religion, or a trade route. They independently arrived at the same radical conclusion. You can cut into the human skull, remove bone, and the person can live. Let that land for a second. Independent discovery. On every populated continent, thousands of years before anybody coined the word surgery. Sincere question, when was the last time you independently invented anything? Because I came up with a brilliant hack last week for organizing my charging cables, and it turned out IKEA already sells a product for that. So, not exactly in the same category. Now, the part where it gets genuinely uncomfortable, let's talk about the tools. Because this is where modern medicine gets embarrassed in a very specific and very quietly acknowledged way. Obsidian. That's volcanic glass. When you fracture it correctly, it doesn't break like regular rock. It cleaves along an almost molecular edge. The cutting surface of a properly knapped obsidian blade can be as thin as 3 nanometers. To put that in perspective, a single red blood cell is about 6,000 to 8,000 nanometers across. An obsidian edge is finer than anything you can see without an electron microscope. Under that same electron microscope, a modern surgical steel scalpel, the sharpest blade in a hospital operating room, looks like a handsaw. Jagged. Serrated. Microscopically rough. Obsidian cuts cleaner. Full stop. Fewer cells are ruptured in the surrounding tissue. The inflammatory response is smaller. Some surgeons in the modern era have actually experimented with obsidian scalpels for certain delicate procedures and noted better healing outcomes. Ancient Peruvian surgeons knew this, not from research papers, from watching, from the fact that patients recovered better when certain tools were used. Empirical observation, the exact same methodology that eventually became the scientific method, which makes the next statistic so absolutely devastating to our sense of historical superiority. The Inca-era surgeons in Peru, working with stone tools, no germ theory, no antibiotics, no sterile field, achieved trepanation survival rates between 75 and 83%. Some sites show 91%. During the American Civil War, 1860s, 2,000 years later, surgeons using metal instruments in a society that had already developed anesthesia and had some understanding of infection, their mortality rate for similar cranial surgeries was between 46 and 56%. Read that again. American Civil War surgeons killed more patients during brain surgery than Incan surgeons did with rocks. The gap isn't small, it's enormous, and it's embarrassing in a way that the history books kind of gloss over. I'm not trying to romanticize the past. The past was horrific in approximately 1,000 ways I enjoy not living through, but the idea that medical competence is a straight line from primitive to advanced? The skull from Ensisheim and 800-plus trepanned skulls from ancient Peru just carved a massive hole in that theory. Somewhat appropriately. So how did they do it without killing everyone? 3 things, and each one of them required a level of systematic observation that we don't credit these people with. First, technique. The surgeons who achieved the highest survival rates had developed specific methods to avoid catastrophic damage. In Peru, researchers analyzing hundreds of skulls found a clear evolution of technique over 2 millennia. From scraping and cutting that frequently breached the brain lining, to far more controlled approaches that carefully stayed above it. They were iterating, improving, doing what we would call clinical refinement, just without the journals. Second, pharmacology. The Andean surgeons almost certainly used coca leaves. We know this because coca was deeply embedded in Incan culture and had been for centuries prior. The alkaloids in coca leaves, when applied topically, or when a healer chewed the leaves and applied the saliva directly, provide genuine localized numbing. It's not fentanyl, but it's not nothing either. On top of that, chicha, fermented maize beer, was used as a sedative agent, and there's evidence of other plant compounds with psychoactive properties being part of the surgical toolkit. Datura, tobacco, San Pedro cactus. These people had a pharmacopoeia. It just lived in the forest. Third, this is the part that hits me hardest. Knowledge of anatomy. Not from textbooks. From watching. From the accumulation of experience across generations. Knowing which part of the skull to avoid, where the big blood vessels ran close to the surface, how deep was too deep, what a dangerous bleed looked like versus a manageable one. This knowledge lived in the hands and the memory of the practitioner. It was transmitted through apprenticeship, through tradition, through someone doing it wrong, losing a patient, and making damn sure they never made that same mistake again. The system worked because failure had immediate, irreversible consequences. Natural selection applied to medical technique. And here's the thing that I actually can't stop thinking about. Someone chose to lie still for this. Or was held still. Or was sedated enough not to fight it. Either way, at some point, a person with a debilitating condition, a head injury, a brain tumor we'd never be able to diagnose now, severe epilepsy, some kind of crushing intracranial pressure, that person placed themselves in the hands of someone else. They trusted someone to cut open their skull with a piece of volcanic glass. And in the Ensisheim case, it happened twice to the same man, which means after the first surgery, after surviving the experience of having his skull cut open, after months of recovery, after whatever pain and disorientation that entailed, he needed it done again. And he said yes, or more likely the people around him decided he needed it. His community kept him alive, fed him, cared for him, monitored him through the recovery. And then when he deteriorated again, the healer came back. This is what the bone tells us that a stone tool never could. These people cared for each other, deeply. The investment required to perform this surgery, the knowledge, the planning, the aftercare, means someone in that community decided this one person was worth it. Worth the risk, worth the resources. In a world where every able body was needed for hunting, for gathering, for survival, someone was kept, tended to, operated on, twice. That's not savagery. That's humanity. Arguably more visible and unambiguous than almost anything we see in the archaeological record. The skull from Ensisheim is about 4 inches by 4 inches of bone. You could hold it in one hand, and scientists spent nearly a century misreading it. They looked at those holes and saw violence, trauma, war, because that fit the story they'd already decided was true, that prehistoric people were brutal and thoughtless and basically just angry apes with posture. Then the microscope came along and said, no, look at the edges, look at the new growth. This person was cared for. And suddenly that little piece of bone became evidence for something far more interesting than ancient brutality. It became evidence for ancient genius, for ancient empathy, for a kind of medicine so refined that we spent generations failing to recognize it as medicine at all. I find it genuinely strange that the most radical discovery in the history of paleoanthropology isn't some new species of human or some impossible artifact. It's the discovery that these people already had most of what it took to be us. They just had to figure it out the hard way. Without the benefit of peer-reviewed journals, without hospital systems or pharmaceutical companies or the accumulated knowledge of the internet, without any of the scaffolding that lets me sit here, in a chair, in a climate-controlled room, with a back that hurts from bad posture, worried about whether my delivery is going to arrive before 8 p.m. And yet, here's what I want you to sit with after this. If you had a debilitating head condition, a growing pressure in your skull, seizures, unbearable pain, and the only person who could help you had no diploma, no sterile equipment, no pharmaceutical support, but had spent their entire life learning through experience. Would you let them? Because that man in Ensisheim did. And he walked out of it. Twice. And frankly, I don't know if I'm impressed or terrified or both. Probably both. Drop your answer in the comments, because I genuinely want to know. And I want to know what you think they were actually treating. Some of those cases are still debated by researchers today, and the range of conditions they might have been addressing is genuinely wild. If this video cracked your skull open a little, intellectually, not literally, please, hit the like button and subscribe. I don't have a stone blade to incentivize you with, but the algorithm is basically its own form of ancient terror, and your support helps more than you know. Turn on notifications if you want to be first in line. Next time I find something in the archaeological record that we've been completely wrong about for 100 years, which at this rate happens a lot.